great to have you on the programme.
Thank you, Sheila.
His intervention, Ayman Safadi's intervention there was an interesting one, isn't it? Because he's talking about two very different groups of Arabs, isn't he, when he says what he says? It's valid what he says, but it leaves out a certain something as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it really does go right to the root of the problem, though. What is Israel's endgame is a question I have to answer many times a day at times like this after covering the region for so long. And it's very, very difficult to discern. In the case of Benjamin Netanyahu, I think he's a man of no strategic vision, but he's all about tactical survival. So for him, the process over the last 25, 30 years for Israel has been, let's just get by, let us use military force to ensure our security, rather than take what is an existential gamble, potentially, certainly from the Israeli perspective, with a long-term solution, a two-state solution that, in the view of the Israeli right, and indeed the centre and some in the left, could move the front line with these forces that they claim to be surrounded by, literally to their doorstep. Now, there are many voices, of course, inside Israel who think that that is nonsense, but that is the long-term strategic vision that the Jordanian foreign minister was calling for there. And I think it's very important that he reminded the world and undermined this notion that it is Israel surrounded by enemies. It does have enemies in Hezbollah. It has not advanced the two-state solution. The Likud party under Benjamin Netanyahu also has a written policy, which in some ways echoes Hamas, in saying that every piece of territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea will be Israeli sovereign territory. Of course, the Hamas slogan is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Yeah. So they're kind of competing long-term strategic visions there.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? When the Jordanian foreign minister said what he said, my first thought was the Abraham Accords and those Arab nations that were prepared to, out of a huge degree of self-interest as well, because Israel is a tech and economic superpower. It's got its problems because of the current situation, but I'm guessing that looking to the future, they would like a slice of that knowledge, a slice of that trade. So it's not all out of selflessness, is it, that they would do this? But the same simply doesn't apply to Iran, Hamas and Hezbollah, does it? And they are surrounded by them.
Yeah, so you've got, let's start with Iran. Iran has had presidents for the last 20 years or so that have said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but more or less, Israel is a cancer that needs to be cut out of the body of the Middle East, a kind of certainly interpreted in Israel and by critics of Iran as a genocidal policy. In support of that, they back Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a state within a state in Lebanon. It can mobilize, it claims, 150,000 people. It sent 40,000 people to fight for Assad. It is also part of an international criminal mafia network of drug smuggling and money laundering. And then down in Gaza, you've got a Sunni organization, which in the form of Hamas, that is also not clear really whether they really mean the destruction of Israel or the destruction of the concept of the Jewish state, but again, has consistently attacked Israel no matter how much military pressure they've been put on. They're still firing rockets into Israel, and they are also backed by Iran. So in that context, one can see why perhaps Netanyahu's conducting this campaign now against Hezbollah, an organization that it claims has the capability to fire rockets and hit targets deep within Israeli territory.
Well, it is essentially an army within a state, isn't it? It's a non-state army within a state, in part, Hezbollah.
Oh, no question about it. It also has members of government, parliament. It has guaranteed, more or less guaranteed, in terms of the sectarian structure of the constitution in Lebanon. A certain number of seats are reserved for certain communities, and the Shia vote often goes to Hezbollah. So they have parliamentarians, they have a medical infrastructure, but above all, it is a militant military organization that depends very, very strongly for sources of income and direction from Iran and from drug manufacture and other criminal activities for the rest of its funding.
I mean, sadly, and probably inevitably, civilians are killed in these kinds of actions, even though you could probably differentiate between, I'll let you speak for yourself if you don't want to differentiate between the events in Gaza and the events in Lebanon so far anyway, but civilians inevitably caught up in it.
Well, I think, sorry to interrupt there, but I think there's one very, very stark difference. And we saw this with the unclaimed but nonetheless clearly obviously Israeli attacks on Hezbollah's communication systems, with the pager bombs, and the next day with the walkie-talkies. Now with the very, even though there's over 1,000 dead, 1 million people, according to the Lebanese government, have been displaced, the Israelis do seem to be conducting, quote unquote, or in more targeted operations than they are in Gaza. I think there is a very stark difference indeed. It's difficult to see when you're seeing such ultra-violence, but the sort of violence, the profligate use of very high explosive bombs to attack militants in Gaza is very much, it was incomparable with the operations
in Lebanon.
Inside Lebanon, which therefore begs the question, why are the Israelis conducting those sorts of, why have the Israelis been conducting such abandoned, if you like, operations inside Gaza, with, of course, allegations of the threat of ethnic cleansing and genocide coming from a lot of Israel's critics. In the case of Lebanon, it is very widespread. It is the most violent air campaign I think the Israelis have ever unleashed. Hezbollah is suffering unprecedented levels of casualties. I think the numbers of of civilian casualties inside Lebanon are increasing exponentially. They're just in the last 24 hours, the Israelis hit in central Beirut rather than in the Hezbollah stronghold in the south of the capital there. So all of that is mounting up to a humanitarian disaster too.
And on Nasrallah, I mean, inevitably, as we've seen with Yahya Sinwar in Hamas, these individuals become synonymous with the organisation for pretty obvious reasons. They have important leadership roles in them. Nasrallah, I hadn't realised until he was killed, I hadn't realised the depth to which he personally was involved in things like Syria, for example, the siege of Aleppo, and how much Assad had cleaved to Hezbollah for help during that war. I mean, Nasrallah really was responsible for huge numbers of civilian deaths himself, wasn't he, inside Syria?
Well, certainly Hezbollah has been, as one of the most potent fighting forces coming in on the side of the Assad regime at the insistence of Tehran, which of course has got forces there and has been backing both the Assad regime and Hezbollah. Very important route too for the Iranian military support for Hezbollah comes through Syria. That's why the Israelis have been bombarding the Lebanese-Syrian border. So yeah, they've got a very deep connection, and it's very interesting indeed that there are sort of ambivalent feelings in the anti-Israeli establishment, if you like. So there are people around the world, and particularly in the Middle East, who want to see an end to the sort of Gaza campaign that the Israelis have been prosecuting, seen the very frustrating behavior of Israel over the last 20 years in consuming the West Bank, where the Palestinians are supposed to eventually establish a state with settlements, wanting to see some kind of quote-unquote payback, and encouraging kind of fanboying Hezbollah for that. And then at the same time, the grotesque role that Hezbollah has played in the Middle East in terms of support of an organism such as the Assad regime. So there's often this sort of conundrum for a lot of people. I can tell you that inside Lebanon, there will be dismay and hatred at the Israelis, as there often and usually is, but also very deep frustration that once again the Lebanon is being attacked because of the actions of Hezbollah, where again there is sympathy for the support of the Palestinian cause, but no longer a territorial defensive role for Hezbollah in their own country. Of course, that will change if the Israelis, as seems to be threatened, sending ground troops, something I think that Hezbollah would probably welcome on a tactical level.
And Sam, I think it's worth a word before you go on UN Resolution 1701 or as a result of the 2006 war between the two. We're hearing a lot about it, or I've been hearing a lot about it over the weekend. It's worth reminding people or telling people for the first time what that is, because Israel's position is, look, well, that clearly didn't work, did it? So we're taking matters into our own hands here. So what is it, and why was it so key?
Well, it came in, you recall that from about, I can't remember the exact dates, for about nearly 20 years, the Israelis were in occupation of South Lebanon until the year 2000. They withdrew, and then Hezbollah occupied that space that they had been in the south, therefore very, very close to on the Israeli border. Then they had a war in 2006. It actually went quite badly for both sides, arguably. The Israelis lost, they were surprised by the strength of Hezbollah's resistance. But nonetheless, in the sort of the resolution that came after that, in the quote unquote, and I keep using that term because it's all relatively speaking, but in the reduction in fury of the violence between the two sides, Hezbollah was supposed to withdraw north of the Litani River, which is about 30 kilometers, broadly speaking, north of the border with Israel. They didn't do that. What they did do is hollow out mountains. I've been into some of these. They've actually got a kind of Hezbollah land there where you can go into a hollowed out mountain, and they've got a kind of James Bond maze of artillery positions, hospitals, and so on. And they will have repeated that throughout South Lebanon in anticipation of a renewed conflict. So they continue to pose a threat to Israel. Critics of Israel will say, well, the Israelis have continued to pose a threat to Middle Eastern peace because the Netanyahu government has absolutely ruled out a two-state solution. That's not an analytical position with the Palestinians. That's a matter of government policy. So in that context, the region feels partly, in a sense, condemned by both sides to a level of perpetual conflict in and around or with the state of Israel.
Sam, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Sam Kiley, international journalist of more than 30 years standing, former foreign affairs editor at Sky News, which I'm sure you remember him from.